In the heart of North Carolina, inside one of America's most secure vaults, a fortune sat untouched, until one night it disappeared without a trace. $17 million, gone. No alarms, no gunfire, no masked gunmen, just one man, a dream of a new life, and a mistake so simple, it would unravel everything. It was supposed to be the perfect crime, but what followed was a whirlwind of betrayal, greed, and a chase that would cross international borders. And even now, decades later, a crucial piece of the mystery is still missing. Where did the missing millions go? Who really outsmarted who? And why has no one ever found the rest of the fortune? Stay with us as we uncover the mystery of the greatest heist in American history. To understand how one of the largest cash heists in American history could happen without a single gunshot, you have to start in Charlotte, North Carolina in '97. A city growing fast, full of ambition, but hiding cracks beneath its polished surface. At the center of it all was the Loomis Fargo and Company vault, a fortress designed to store millions in cash every single day. Guarded by reinforced steel doors, alarm systems, and armed personnel, it was built to be impenetrable. But security isn't just about walls and locks. It's about people, and that's where the real weakness began. David Ghantt was an ordinary man, quiet, dependable, invisible to most. He was a vault supervisor, trusted to oversee millions of dollars, trusted to follow the rules without question. But behind his tired eyes and quiet demeanor was a growing desperation. A marriage that felt like a trap, a dead-end job that offered no future, and a secret infatuation with a former co-worker, Kelly Campbell, who had a dangerous idea and the charm to make him listen. Campbell wasn't working alone. Behind her was Steve Chambers, a man with bigger dreams than morals, a schemer who saw in David Ghantt the perfect pawn. Together, they planted a fantasy: steal the cabin, vanish into paradise, and live lives most people could only dream about. Ghantt, starved for excitement and blinded by longing, agreed. It was a plan that sounded almost too easy. Load the money into a van after hours, drive away under the cover of darkness, and flee the country before anyone noticed. No guns, no violence, just nerve, opportunity, and trust in the wrong people. In the weeks leading up to the heist, they practiced every detail. Security routines were memorized. Blind spots in the camera system were exploited. The van was readied. And on the night of October 4th, 1997, David Ghantt made a choice that would change his life forever. He didn't realize it yet, but the perfect crime was already doomed. Not because of law enforcement, not because of bad luck, but because greed, betrayal, and human weakness would prove far more dangerous than any police investigation could ever be. And when the vault doors swung shut behind him that night, sealing $17 million in stolen cash into a waiting van, David Ghantt crossed a line he could never come back from. October 4th, 1997. The warehouse air was thick and stale under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Every second dragged out painfully as David Ghantt stood inside the Loomis Fargo facility, staring at the mountain of cash stacked neatly inside the vault. More money than most people would ever see in a lifetime. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the first bundle. He wasn't a criminal, not yet. He was a man caught between desperation and hope, love and foolishness. With a deep breath, he reminded himself, there was no turning back. The plan was simple, at least on paper. Disable the cameras, load the money into the Loomis Fargo van, leave quietly, unnoticed. Everything had been rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. But the reality of the night, the sheer weight of what he was doing, pressed down on him heavier than any bag of cash. One by one, the duffel bags filled with cash piled up inside the van. Tens, hundreds, thousands of pounds of small bills. It wasn't just numbers anymore. It was real, tangible. $17 million in used, worn currency, almost untraceable, nearly perfect. But there was a problem. He had miscalculated. There was simply too much money. Bag after bag still sat inside the vault with no room left in the van. He stood frozen for a moment, heart hammering in his chest. Should he try to cram more in? Should he risk taking longer? In the end, he made a split-second decision. Leave behind what wouldn't fit. Nearly $1 million, abandoned on the cold concrete floor. Ghantt slammed the vault door shut, locking it behind him for the last time. As he slipped into the driver's seat, the warehouse seemed to hold its breath. He turned the ignition. No alarms, no sirens, just the steady thrum of the van's engine cutting through the night. The city around him was silent, oblivious to the heist unfolding in its heart. Streetlights blurred past as he drove to the rendezvous point, where a getaway car waited. The transfer was fast, practiced, mechanical. Minutes later, the van and its stolen cargo sat abandoned, and David Ghantt was on his way to Mexico, carrying only a small fraction of the cash, just enough to survive until the others could launder the rest. He crossed the border within hours, heart still racing, ears straining for any sound of pursuit that never came. For a fleeting moment, under the warm Mexican sun, it seemed like they had done it. $17 million. No bloodshed, no resistance. A perfect crime. But perfection is an illusion. Back in Charlotte, as David Ghantt tried to vanish into paradise, the cracks were already forming. Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell, the supposed masterminds, couldn't resist the sudden taste of wealth. Lavish mansions, luxury cars, shopping sprees, all bought in broad daylight, all drawing eyes they couldn't afford to attract. The clock had started ticking, and David Ghantt, alone, isolated and thousands of miles from home, the FBI investigation begins. It didn't take long for the alarm bells to start ringing back in Charlotte. When Loomis Fargo employees arrived the next morning, they found the vault locked, but something was wrong. Security footage had gaps, bags of cash were missing, and the armored van gone without a trace. Within hours, the FBI was called in. What they found stunned even the most seasoned agents. This wasn't a sloppy, rushed robbery. It was precise, calculated. A thief who knew exactly where the blind spots were and exactly how to move unseen. At first, suspicion fell on the inside. It had to be an employee, someone with access, someone trusted. And David Gantt's sudden disappearance didn't help his case. As agents pulled his employment file and dug into his personal life, a pattern emerged: mounting debts, marital struggles, and an unusual friendship with Kelly Campbell, a former Loomis Fargo employee with her own checkered past. Meanwhile, Steve Chambers, the real architect behind the heist, was making critical mistakes. Instead of laying low, he and his wife Michelle began spending wildly. They moved from a modest trailer park to a mansion worth over $600,000, all paid for in cash. They bought Rolex watches, designer clothes, new cars. Michelle even joked to friends that they had hit the lottery. It didn't take long for neighbors to grow suspicious. Tips started pouring in. A new mansion, flashes of unexplained wealth, people who used to count pennies now throwing lavish parties. The FBI was listening, and closing in. The final break came when agents traced a series of cash deposits back to Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell. Under surveillance, Campbell cracked first. Facing the possibility of serious prison time, she began to talk, and once the truth started unraveling, it came apart fast. The FBI pieced it together: the plan, the players, the betrayal. David Ghantt was thousands of miles away in Mexico, likely believing he was still in control. What he didn't know was that Steve Chambers had no intention of sharing the money. In fact, a hitman had already been hired to silence Ghantt permanently. The perfect crime was unraveling, not by police work alone, but by the greed and carelessness of the very people who had engineered it. While the FBI was tightening the noose back in North Carolina, David Ghantt was living a life he had never dreamed possible, but it wasn't the paradise he had imagined. After crossing the border into Mexico, Ghantt settled into a modest life in Cozumel. Far from the flashy wealth Steve Chambers was flaunting, Ghantt kept a low profile, living off a carefully rationed supply of stolen questions. He dyed his hair, grew a beard, stayed in small hotels. Every day he looked over his shoulder, knowing he was a marked man, but he had no idea how close danger really was. Back in the States, Steve Chambers was growing nervous. Ghantt knew too much. He was a loose end, and loose ends had to be cut. Unbeknownst to David, Chambers had hired a hitman to track him down in Mexico and silence him for good. But like everything else in this case, the plan was sloppy. The so-called hitman, inexperienced, reckless, quickly drew attention. And when authorities intercepted communications between Chambers and the would-be assassin, they realized something bigger was at play. The FBI now had a golden opportunity. Instead of rushing in, they waited. They watched. They let Chambers and his crew dig themselves deeper. Meanwhile, they worked with Mexican authorities to quietly locate David Ghantt. It didn't take long. Ghantt's spending habits, modest as they were, eventually led investigators straight to him. In March 1998, 5 months after the heist, Ghantt walked into a resort town grocery store, unaware he was being watched. As he exited, federal agents closed in. The arrest was clean, fast, and shockingly quiet. No chase, no struggle, just the stunned realization on David Gantt's face as the dream he'd clung to came crashing down. During interrogation, Ghantt was surprisingly candid. He laid out the entire plan, how it started, who was involved, and how Steve Chambers had manipulated him from the beginning. He confirmed the worst. Chambers never intended to share the money. The fantasy of reuniting and living a life of luxury had been a lie from the very start. Back in Charlotte, armed with Ghantt's confession, the FBI moved quickly. Raids were conducted, arrests were made. Steve Chambers, Kelly Campbell, Michelle Chambers, and several others involved in laundering the stolen money were taken into custody. The so-called perfect crime had collapsed under the weight of its own greed and betrayal. The FBI recovered about 95% of the stolen $17 million, a staggering amount, but not quite all. To this day, a small fraction of that money has never been found. As for David Ghantt, he ultimately pled guilty and was sentenced to over 7 years in federal prison. Steve Chambers received an even harsher sentence. The others faced their own justice, each paying a price for their part in the largest cash robbery in U.S. history. In the end, the Loomis Fargo heist wasn't just a story of stolen millions. It was a story of human weakness, a cautionary tale of how dreams of easy fortune can turn into nightmares when loyalty, greed, and betrayal collide. Worth it? The Loomis Fargo heist of 1999 remains one of the most astonishing crimes in American history, not just because of the staggering amount of cash stolen, but because of the way it all fell apart. At its core, this wasn't a story of master criminals or criminal genius. It was a story about ordinary people who saw a shortcut to the American dream and paid dearly for it. David Ghantt, the trusted vault supervisor who dreamed of a better life, found himself betrayed by the very people he thought were friends. Driven by a mixture of desperation, loneliness, and misplaced loyalty, he crossed a line he could never uncross. In the end, instead of living in paradise, he spent years behind bars, thinking every day about how a moment of weakness had rewritten his life. Steve and Michelle Chambers, blinded by greed, couldn't resist the siren call of sudden wealth. Their need to show off, to prove they had made it, was their undoing. It wasn't brilliant detective work that caught them. It was arrogance. It was the flashy spending, the whispered conversations in small-town neighborhoods, the cash deposits they thought were invisible, but left a trail as clear as footprints in fresh snow. And so what was supposed to be the perfect crime collapsed into chaos. In the end, justice was served. Almost everyone involved served prison time. Careers were ruined, families shattered, lives changed forever. But the biggest lesson of the Loomis Fargo heist isn't found in court transcripts or FBI files. It's a lesson about human nature, about how quickly dreams of a better life can twist into greed, betrayal, and self-destruction, about how some risks cost far more than we ever imagined. Today, the Loomis Fargo robbery lives on in documentaries, books, and even Hollywood films. But strip away the glamour, the jokes, and the fascination, and you're left with a haunting question. Was it really worth it? $17 million, traded for prison cells, broken trust, and years lost. The next time you hear about the perfect crime, remember Loomis Fargo. Remember how easily good intentions can rot, How the thirst for more, for easy money, can destroy everything it touches. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, if you love deep dives into true crime, history's greatest mysteries, and the untold stories behind the headlines, make sure to hit that like button. It helps us keep bringing you powerful stories just like this one. We'd love to hear what you think. Could you ever imagine yourself in David Gantt's shoes? Would you take the risk or walk away? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe. Join our community, where every week we bring you the stories that captivate, shock, and stay with you long after the video ends. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and remember, not every treasure is worth the price it demands.